in today's episode of Plants of the Gods. Join host Mark Plotkin in conversation with Editor-in-Chief and CEO of Mongabay, Rhett Butler. Butler has worked and traveled in all the world's rainforest regions, from Central America to Sarawak, giving him unique insights into tropical rainforest conversation. We'll hear about everything from Mongabay's origins to Rhett's inspiration for his work, and ultimately, how best to save the rainforest.
Welcome, everyone, to Plants of the Gods. We have a very special guest today that I'll be introducing. But I just want to go back a few decades. I remember reading an interview with Henry Kissinger, who some people, certainly not all, regard as a great and insightful person. And what I remember about it was him saying that, the idea of worrying about the environment, that's really a soft issue that really doesn't have that much to do with human well-being compared to something like nuclear disarmament. And with the success of the movie Oppenheimer, nuclear disarmament, with the terrible situation in Ukraine, nuclear disarmament is once again back in the headlines. But over the headlines is the issue of climate change. And so this proves that this idea that we're all engaged here in terms of protecting the environment, protecting the rainforest, better stewardship of natural resources. We live in a world where we're looking at boiling oceans. We live in a world where people are falling down in the street in Arizona being treated for third-degree burns because of the melting asphalt. So I don't think old Henry was right when he said this wasn't really an issue of paramount importance. It is a top nuclear disarmament in most of the headlines we're reading today. Now, today we have my friend and colleague, Rhett Butler, and I recently wrote a note about Rhett that I want to share with you because I think it's the best introduction to him and his work. It's no exaggeration to say that Rhett has almost single-handedly invented the field of rainforest journalism. He's obviously not the first person to write about this topic, but he's certainly the first to make all rainforests his journalistic beat, and to have created an organization, a network, a website, a podcast, which covers tropical America, Africa, and Asia on a daily basis. His Mongabay team, and I include Rhett in that number, is fearless, relentless, insightful, and unceasingly accurate. And this is in an age where being an environmental journalist can be one of the world's most dangerous professions, especially in countries like Brazil and Colombia, which I know firsthand. I've been working on neotropical rainforest issues for almost 4 decades, and Mongabay remains my go-to site, not only due to its accuracy, unusual for an environmental website, but also because I'm always finding information and details I would not learn otherwise. As such, Rhett has created a unique and invaluable reference useful for everyone from high government officials to remote forest dwellers. So on that note, I say, welcome, Rhett.
Well, thank you, Mark. It's a pleasure to be here. And that was an extremely generous introduction. So thank you.
Added advantage of being accurate. Now, I want to start today, Rhett, jumping around the world in 3 special places. One is Yasuni in Ecuador, the other is Borneo, and the third is Nosy Mongabay. I'm one of your loyal listeners and readers who's been to Nosy Mongabay. But I want you to connect those 3 dots for me and how it proved formative in your career in getting you and Mongabay where you are today.
Yeah, well, thank you for that setup. I was someone who was always interested in frogs and lizards growing up. And as I kind of learned more about those creatures, I figured out that the rainforest had kind of the most diversity and also the most interesting herps. And so I was very passionate about these creatures. And so I growing up, my mother was a travel agent. So we traveled, travel was a priority for my family. And so I would lobby my parents to sometime take me to the rainforest so I could see these cool frogs. The first time I kind of went to, I guess, what you call a real rainforest and had that experience was right near Yasuni in Ecuador. And so I was about 12. And we stayed in a fairly traditional indigenous community, and I just had an amazing time. I would go out with the kids my age and look for frogs and fish and explore the rainforest, and it was really special for me. I came home, and a few months later, there was a story in the San Francisco Chronicle about an oil spill that had happened on the Rio Napo upriver from where I'd been. And so what that meant in real terms was that area I visited was now coated in an oil slick. And so all I could think about was what had happened to my friends in the forest and the animals. So that's what moved me from someone who appreciated cool animals in the jungle to being aware of environmental issues. And so I started to track what was happening in the environment generally, but especially around rainforests at that point. So then the thing that actually moved me to action was a few years later, I was in high school and I had an experience. I was able to go to Borneo, so Malaysian Borneo, which is one of the most biodiverse parts of the island. And I had another amazing experience in this gorgeous rainforest. And in particular, there's a moment where I was sitting by this creek and I was picking the leeches off my boots and my pants, and this wild orangutan passed over my head. It was a male orangutan. It turned around and it kind of looked at me for a second and kept going. Don't think it really cared that I was there, but for me, it was a very magical moment. I came home from that forest and I kept in correspondence with the scientists I met there. And a few months later, the forest was pulped to make paper. And now it's an oil palm plantation. And so that the destruction of that rainforest pushed me to want to take an action to try to save rainforests. And so I began writing a book about rainforests. And so that's what I did in college. My major had nothing to do with rainforest or journalism, but that's what I was passionate about. So that's what I did. Thanks to some high school credit, I was able to finish school year early. I spent that extra year working on this book, finished the book, found a publisher, went through peer reviews, and then the publisher came back to me and said, "Okay, we'd like to publish this book, but we don't have the budget to put pictures in it. So this is going to be like a textbook." And to me, that really defeated the purpose of what I was trying to do, which is convey the beauty of rainforest and why we should save them. And so powerful visuals are really important to that. And so I thought, well, I didn't write this book for money. I wrote it for impact. And so I decided to put the book online as a website so people could read it for free. And I decided to name it after another special place, which is Nosy Mongabay, which is what you just mentioned. So Nosy Mongabay is an island off of the northeastern part of Madagascar. It's covered with rainforest, home to all sorts of interesting animals, from lemurs to these amazing Bokesia geckos, surrounded by coral reefs. There's a humpback whale population there that's very robust. So it's a very special place for me. And when I created this website, I wanted to have a unique name. So if I typed, the name into Alta Vista, it would be, the only thing referencing my website would be relevant to it. So there would be no confusion about, it would just be easy to track who was using it. And so I decided to anglicize the name, and I called it Mongabay, which is after that island. And so that's how those dots connect. And that kind of explains my whole journey with, how Mongabay came to be what it is today.
Well, I don't think many people, certainly me and many of my colleagues, have had the formative experience in tropical Africa, Asia, and Latin America. So that is a unique beginning to enter this field. But let me quote Frank Zappa. Frank Zappa said, "Writing about music is like dancing about architecture." So writing about rainforests and writing about conservation, so what? Who cares? So let's flip the script and give the example of United Cacao and show how this rainforest journalism can have real impact.
Yes, United Cacao is one of my favorite stories of impact from Mongabay's reporting. So back in 2014, there was this new platform called Global Forest Watch, where sort of for the first time, it was really easy for anyone to look at satellite data aggregated with all sorts of other information to see what was happening in the world's forests. And I thought this was an incredible tool for journalism, both for getting story ideas, but also for adding data to reporting we're doing anyway. And so one of the early things that popped up in this initiative that we developed around Global Forest Watch was using the platform for firsthand in the field reporting. So it could start with someone sitting in the U.S. or in Quito or wherever, looking at a map, looking at what's happening with satellite data, and then we could go out and visit the field and see what's really happening. And so in 2014, this company had an IPO in London. So had this stock offering. It raised money, and it portrayed itself as the only pure play cacao company that was publicly listed. and it was sustainable, working with communities, going to produce a product we all love, chocolate, from this initiative. So that was happening in the financial markets. Meanwhile, at Mongabay, we were using this platform, Global Forest Watch, to look at things that were popping up in terms of potential deforestation worldwide. And in the Peruvian Amazon, we saw these pink polygons appearing. And we thought, this is interesting. And so we started to talk with various researchers and NGOs. And then we sent a field reporter to the site. And it turned out that this company, United Cacao, was actually clearing this forest. So it had been misleading the public and investors because it was, clearing primary forest for these plantations. So it was not actually sustainable. And so we did reporting on this issue. And the great thing about this was there was all this really excellent science about what had been there before, and then tracking it as it changed over time. So you could look on satellite images and see month by month the forest coming down. And then people like Greg Asner, who's a researcher, had flown over this area with an airplane before the deforestation occurred and mapped the biodiversity and the carbon. So like all the baseline data was there. And so we could very clearly show that what United Cacao was saying, that it was just, converting some degraded ag land into plantations was false. So we moved ahead with publishing the story. United Cacao tried to block the story before it came out. And the law firm, we had a top 5 US law firm contact us saying that they were going to sue us out of existence for publishing the story. And, the response was, we have all this data, so you don't have there's no libel or slander grounds here. This is all based off, factual information. So we're going to publish the story anyway. So we published the story. That law firm ended up dropping United Cacao as a client. And, it really brought worldwide attention to what was happening, in this kind of remote forest in the most biodiverse part of, the Peruvian Amazon. And so what it did is it generated a whole bunch of media coverage internationally around this issue that had previously been pretty obscure. NGOs started to do campaigns around it, including going after the London Stock Exchange, saying that, this company is violating, various policies. And the Peruvian government also launched an investigation and found that they were, in breach of their permits. And so their operating permit was suspended, and fast forward 2 years, the company was delisted from the London Stock Exchange. So the reason that was important was it had been planning to raise more capital in order to clear about 100,000 hectares of more forest for oil palm and cacao. And so that would have, if that had happened, it would have translated to about 30 million tons of CO2 emissions, which is equivalent to driving a passenger car 72 billion miles. So, I mean, it's a substantial amount of carbon. And so all this resulted from a combination of Mongabay's reporting, this really excellent science, this activism. So it was all these different actors operating this ecosystem that led to this very positive outcome. And it was just nice that Mongabay could sort of contribute to that. And so that's a really, I think, concrete example of how journalism can sort of contribute to real world impact.
Well, one of the things I want to do with this interview is bring you and Mongabay's messages to a broader audience. So what I would like to do is put in our show notes the best account of this United Cacao story and a couple of other success stories, both from your podcast and from the website, so people get a sense of these successes and are able to take a deeper dive. But you touch on something which is near and dear to my heart, which is this whole idea as rainforests as a source of carbon and little else. And you wrote a paper recently, which I think of as conservation besides carbon, that I think needs to have wider readership, even though it's attracted a lot of attention. So can you talk about the conclusions of that paper about this over-focus on carbon as the answer or the problem?
Yeah, so certainly. And thank you for bringing this up. There's been it's been kind of interesting the past 20 years, which I'm sure you've observed, where tropical forests have kind of gone from kind of a backwater niche issue to something that's much more relevant to a lot more people. But a lot of that focus has really been on the carbon of forests. And so that's almost entirely the emphasis of a lot of the investment. And as a result, some of the other co-benefits of forests have kind of fallen by the wayside. So that's their value to the people who live in those forests, the people who are outside the forest in terms of the ecosystem services that are afforded by healthy and productive forest ecosystems, so water, but also lack of focus on biodiversity. And so I think that's starting to change now, but certainly from, I'd say, like the late 90s, mid 2000s to the mid 2010s, I mean, that was really the emphasis. And so bringing those co-benefits not only is important for forest conservation, but also sort of increases the recognized value of forests. So if you're just making a decision about whether to save a forest based on carbon, that's only a small part of the overall value that a forest is providing for humanity and other species. So that's kind of the gist of the paper. But, in I guess like two of the major macro trends that have occurred over the past 20 years is sort of this focus on forests for nature-based solutions. But then the second component of that is we now, because of satellite monitoring and other forms of remote sensing, we know what's happening in forests better than ever before. So we no longer have ignorance as an excuse for not taking action. So we can see what's happening. And so what that has done is it's made forest conservation relevant to a lot more people and sort of broadened the constituency for forest conservation. But we have to continue moving beyond just carbon in order for that to continue. And I think that's the value of that, is that it just makes forests even more relevant to more people.
Yeah, I completely agree with that. And, I compare this type of approach to conservation to flying over Monument Valley in a little plane and everybody runs to one side. I see so much of conservation being wrong-headed because it's so reductionist. It's all about carbon. It's all about endangered species. It's all about protected areas. It's all about human rights. Well, if you do it right, it's about all of those things. A perfect and ironic example, I don't know if you saw a couple of years ago, there was an article in the New Yorker about working with the Hadza, the last hunter-gatherer tribe. There's an excellent movie made about them by Bill and Lori Bennetson, our board chairs. And it talked about the fact that their microbiome was richer than everybody else's. And the reason was they're some of the last people on the planet who've never taken antibiotics. So one wag said to me, well, you guys should be trekking through the rainforest with your plant presses looking for new cures for cancer. You should have little buckets that you can get fecal samples and take back to the lab. So it's sarcastic, but it's true. I mean, once again, it gets to the point that, as we say in Suriname, the rainforest holds answers to questions we haven't even asked. And so this idea that it's all about carbon or it's all about monitoring or it's all about endangered species is too simplistic. And that's one of the things I admire about Mongabay is it's all of those things, right? It's not just about cute animals. It's not just about indigenous peoples. And that's the approach I think we should have across the board in conservation, not just rainforests, the boreal forest, the Arctic, the oceans, and everything else.
Yeah, definitely. I think and one of the things is that serendipity can be really important. So, for example, like when Redd Plus emerged in the mid 2000s, like it was very focused on carbon, and a lot of people were saying, "Oh, well, this is like going to be, we can make a ton of money off selling carbon credits, and this is going to blow up, and we're going to save forests by 2020." But what happened right away is that once you started to move forward with forest carbon projects, it became very clear. We need to figure out actually who owns the rights to these forests and what are effective conservation measures. And so one of the things that emerged out of Redd Plus is sort of the importance of recognizing those rights. And so it actually, a lot of the opposition to Redd in the initial days was really from sort of indigenous communities. And because, rightfully so, it's kind of like, well, these outsiders are going to come in and sell our carbon rights. What's going to happen to us? And are we still going to be able to use the forest? But one of the sort of byproducts of Redd is that recognition of land rights and the role indigenous peoples play in achieving conservation outcomes really got brought to the fore through that process. And so it was kind of this unexpected byproduct of it, where now the focus on indigenous peoples and indigenous rights are very much more in the center of conservation than they were, 10 years ago. And it's kind of interesting because, one of the foundational principles of Amazon Conservation Team, I feel, is indigenous-led conservation. So you were out there in the 90s, and this is your entire model, and now everyone else has sort of jumped on the bandwagon 25, 30 years later. including the big NGOs. And so it's just kind of funny how it's kind of, gone this direction. But I mean, you were really, ACT was really the leader there, and you're the indigenous leadership within the organization, your partners is really something to be commended. On that front.
Well, that's appreciated and accurate. But here's my worry, to go back to the Monument Valley small plane model. Everybody jumps on it at once. It can have some problems. Like, I think we're all glad that the conservation world is realizing that indigenous peoples are the best stewards of their forests and rivers, usually, not always. But the idea that you just run in and dump a bunch of money and you've solved the problem, in many cases you can cause problems. You can worsen problems. And so this idea that if you were set up to protect endangered species, and then you can just run in there and think, oh, I can just partner with indigenous peoples and make it run, is way too simplistic. In my experience, I've been doing this a long time. Human relationships take time. You can't show up in a village in another culture where you don't speak the language, give them a bunch of money, make them wear your t-shirt, take a picture, put it on your website and say, we're partnering with this tribe, right? That's all too common. But again, this goes back to this paper of conservation and carbon, thinking that there is just one answer. There is no magic bullet. We need a shotgun approach. So we do need indigenous land rights. We do need protection of endangered species. We do need mitigation of climate change. The challenges and opportunities have never been greater. So you have a global view of rainforest conservation and destruction, which I think is frankly unique. So give me the good news before we dip into the bad news. Tell me what makes you hopeful. What are the positive signs you're seeing?
So I think one of the positive signs is this growing recognition of the importance of healthy and productive ecosystems for our own well-being. So there's sort of a selfish interest in terms of humanity of maintaining these systems because we benefit from them. And so it's tropical forests, it's carbon, it's water, it's biodiversity. These are all things that are now pretty mainstream to talk about, whereas 20 years ago, that was not the case. Another sort of byproduct of this is, because of the impact we're seeing from environmental degradation, especially climate change, the issues happening in these places are more relevant to people than ever before. So people know that it's very hot outside and that they're dealing with flooding and other catastrophes, and that these are linked to climate change. So it's creating a larger pool of people who are directly interested in what's happening in these kind of far off places. Another thing which you've already talked about is really our ability to assess what's happening in the world. So monitoring what's happening in forests, both in terms of loss of habitat, but then also what's happening with biodiversity. And so I've already said this, but ignorance is no longer an excuse. And so when there's this big drop in deforestation in the Brazilian Amazon between the mid 2000s and mid 2010s, a lot of that was attributed to the fact that Brazil had this monitoring program where they could see what was happening in the forest, and if there was a political will to take action, they could. So landowners stopped clearing all this forest because they're like, oh, well, if I do this, it's a risk. I may, get in trouble, or I may face a fine or go to prison. I mean, that usually wasn't the case, but, that way there is that concern. And now with these sort of these companies that are trading commodities, there's now this deforestation risk in the supply chain. So like if you're trading in the EU, you have to worry about legal risk of commodities that are related to deforestation. So those are all important things. I think also, and again, I've already mentioned this, but the whole idea that there's sort of a broader constituency around forests. So it's no longer just saving panda bears. There are people are recognizing there are people in these forests who depend on them. There is biodiversity. There are health benefits to the forest. There are risks of pathogens emerging as deforestation accelerates. So there are all these reasons to keep forests up beyond just the carbon value or the climate value. So those are all, I think, positive things in the world. And so I guess I'll stop there before we get to the other side of that, of the trends.
Well, again, to go back to this small plane example, it's just that people want to just go in one direction and have too simplistic a view. However, we live in a world, in a capitalist system, which prizes simplification rather than diversity. You cut down a forest and you plant pines in a straight road. I grew up in Louisiana. That's what much of the original land looks like. And how do we get away from that in a model which prizes maximization of profit? Because once again, the world and history is replete of examples of getting a group of people, whether peasants or indigenous peoples, they cut everything down and they plant coffee, and then they have nothing to eat and have to buy stuff, and their diet declines and quality, their quality of life declines. And we just need a way to put money in these people's pockets, indigenous peoples, peasant peoples, that doesn't involve destruction in the rainforest and doesn't make the same mistake of let's just get them all to grow coffee or coca or cacao nut or whatever and live their best life. And I think the best way that groups like Mongabay and ACT can do is help these people prepare for the outside world and deal with it on their own terms, because trying to tell them what to do doesn't work. The U.S. has never learned that lesson, I don't think. And that brings to another question in terms of profit. You run a nonprofit, I run a nonprofit, and I think that people make the mistake of thinking, well, if they're a nonprofit, they don't need money. But Mongabay lives off donations. I want everybody to go to mongabay.com and check it on a regular basis, as I do, and tell us how listeners can support your efforts further.
Well, so certainly making donations is greatly appreciated. So yeah, as Mark mentions, we're a nonprofit organization. We're very transparent about where we spend our money. All of our financials up there, so you can dig into that if you want. We also just appreciate people who share our content. So we understand not everyone has the means to provide financial support, but spreading the word about Mongabay's reporting is really valuable, because our mission is really getting the information out there. And on that note, all of our stories are produced under an Open Creative Commons license, so it means anyone can use them commercially or non-commercially. And so in some parts of the world, we have a lot of distribution via mainstream media outlets, and so it greatly amplifies our reach. We also have a podcast, which Mark graciously mentioned. If you're, I would encourage you to subscribe to that, and also just interact with our community and provide feedback to us. We really appreciate that. So both financial and just being a supporter in terms of reading our content is greatly appreciated.
Well, when I started in the environmental movement 40 years ago, more or less, I remember people saying, well, who cares about rainforests? We have to deal with this population growth. Now I hear, who cares about rainforests? We have to worry about climate change. But as you and I know, these are all connected. One of the things that's put rainforests back in the headlines is this whole psychedelic renaissance that we spent a lot of time talking about on this podcast. So I'm wondering, for you as the perhaps preeminent rainforest journalist, this whole psychedelic rainforest, has this been a boon or a blessing in terms of getting people more interested in indigenous peoples, indigenous knowledge, indigenous healing?
That's an interesting question. I think that you would have a much more informed opinion on this than I do. But I live in Silicon Valley, where microdosing and all this stuff is very popular, and I just don't know if there is a connection in sort of that community to thinking about where these things come from. I think in a lot of respects, the awareness around, if people understand that it's traditional indigenous knowledge where it's coming from, and that this is derived from living in this important rainforest ecosystem, that's great. I just don't know if how strong that connection is among the average person who's into psychedelics.
Well, that ties back into something that you touched on earlier, this whole idea of we can monitor everything. I remember hearing a talk a couple of years ago by a guy saying we can monitor every single tree in the rainforest. And I said, yeah, so what can you do if it gets cut down? Okay, so monitoring has to be partnered with enforcement. I mean, the Amazon Conservation Team has been running an indigenous park guard force for over a decade. That's proof of concept. That's not like a cool idea, right? And this whole idea of the shamanic medicines, I mean, let's face it, ayahuasca comes from the Amazon, psilocybin comes from tropical Mexico, and people said they want to be one with the Godhead and appreciate indigenous culture, but what are they going to do about it? take more psilocybin. So I see that there needs to be more coupling of this wealthy audience in most cases, which has a stated interest in these tropical biocultural conservation issues, but they're not putting their money where their mouth is.
Yeah, and also ensuring that the benefits get back to the people who hold the knowledge, because I've seen, superficially in Peru, is that there are sort of a lot of fly by night scammy people who are pretending to be shamans who are just doing ayahuasca tours basically. So it's not actually reaching the people who've stewarded the knowledge and are part of the rainforest ecosystem. It's other people who are just trying to grift and make money off this I don't know if it's a fad, but this interest in psychedelics. And so that's also a real concern. I think you also see it. I mean, you see it in all sorts of spaces, but I've certainly seen it firsthand in Peru, where a lot of people who are capitalizing it aren't necessarily, I feel like, the people who should be most deserving of the benefits.
Well, we call these rent-a-shaman tours. There is an increasing number of groups, particularly in California, that bring these rainforest medicine men and women through to give ayahuasca or psilocybin, what have you, which is fine. But where's the beef? What happened with the money you raised? Oh, we're going to save the rainforest. Okay, well, what did you do with it? Well, we're coming up with a plan. Well, you raised this money, and now you're going to come up with a plan which never seems to materialize. So maybe I'm getting cynical in my old age, but I'm with you in saying, okay, so how does this translate into helping the people? How does this translate into helping the forest?
Yeah, and it's kind of interesting because it parallels what's happened with tree planting. So I'd say the last 5 years has been like a lot of interest in the concept of tree planting as a way to address climate change, but also other things. But the devil's in the details. I mean, you can have very destructive tree planting projects. And we found that as we kind of dug into the space, we found that there's a lot of kind of grifters, dodgy projects, but there's also projects that just haven't thought through the ramifications of what they're doing. Like whose land are you planting the trees on, and what are you replacing as you plant those trees? Are you converting a native ecosystem to a monoculture? And so, I mean, I think the market is getting smarter, but there's been just a lot of people in the ecosystem who are just trying to make a quick buck and don't really care about the actual impacts of these tree planting projects.
Well, one conservation organization had a huge campaign saying they were going to plant 1 million trees, and it took me 5 months to run it to ground. And the trees they were planting were coffee. And if you know anything about coffee trees wear out after a while. Could be 5 years, could be 40 years. But replanting coffee with coffee doesn't strike me as a very convincing case of reforestation. So again, another organization said that they had planted replanted 1 million acres of Amazon rainforest, and it took me months and months and months to find out that it really wasn't in the Amazon. It was in the Sahara, the savanna ecosystem next door, and they weren't native species. So
Yeah.
this is why these sort of facile descriptions of we're saving the rainforest, we're replanting the rainforest, we're helping the shamans, where's the beef?
Yeah, we did an investigation several years ago on a tree planting project in Cameroon, where supposedly they were, reforesting Africa. But what they're actually doing was cutting down the native forest and replacing it with oil palm plantations, and then trying to get both carbon credits and market it as a, reforestation project. I mean, completely nuts. I mean, it's since been suspended, but we did a big investigation on that.
Well, this again brings me back to Mongabay. This is my go-to place to check these things because these types of efforts, replanting carbon credits, yada, 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 they're popping up everywhere all the time. And Mongabay, for me, is the go-to site to see, well, is this for real or not? And it's not like you cover all these, but I know when I read that, it's not some sort of bait and switch smoke and mirrors thing, which is my worry in a lot of these websites. I mean, like that famous New Yorker cartoon where one dog is on the keyboard and turns to the dog next to him and says on the internet, nobody can tell you're a dog. And I remember that when I read a lot of these, yes, we're saving the Amazon, and I'm trying to find if there's a there. And sometimes there is, but a lot of times there isn't.
Yeah. I mean, there are, as you say, I mean, there definitely are good projects out there, but not every project is good. So it requires a lot of due diligence to figure out, which are the ones that are worth supporting.
Well, your point about indigenous land rights is fundamental. I mean, we call this approach map, manage, protect, because if they don't have the lands, they don't have access to lands, they have title lands, they have a map of the lands, it's kind of hard to express ownership. And so we see this is fundamental in working with indigenous peoples. Who owns your land, whether you've been living there 50,000 years or not? And so these types of partnerships between indigenous peoples and technology, which in some ways is what Mongabay is all about, is a perfect marriage of indigenous wisdom and 21st century technology. I like the idea that a guy living in a breechcloth with an internet connection can get on Mongabay and find out if this carbon credit company is for real or not. And I know that happens.
Yeah, I mean, that's nice to hear. And one of our goals is to make our content more accessible to those audiences as well. And that's sort of a key component of our strategy for the next several years, is really trying to build that out in order to get that information to those critical stakeholders who often live in information ecosystems where it's very hard to get facts on things.
Yeah, well, I once again salute you and your team. I think you do it better than anybody, and I don't see anybody who even approaches the level of efficiency and effectiveness and accuracy that I continuously find on Mongabay.
Well, thank you for that.
Well, there's lots of bad news about the environment. There's lots of bad news about the rainforest. But I think if you're really telling the true story, you need both. I mean, it's an old journalistic adage, if it bleeds, it leads. People don't want to read about the rainforest that wasn't cut down as much as some terrible thing that, displaced all these poor people. That's all too common, and it's factual. But I think on the one hand, you have to tell people the bad news. You have to give them a sense of hope as well, because there is good news out there. There are success stories, like the United Cacao being just one classic example. And so I will continue to look to Mongabay for more of those. And any parting words as we wind down for the hour?
No, I just want to thank you for this opportunity, but also the amazing work you've done over just for decades now, both through ACT, through your writing, through your advocacy. So I just am deeply appreciative of all that you've done.
Well, that's kind of you to say. I'm kind of in the same boat that you are, Rhett. I started out wanting to make the world a better place. And at this point in my life and my career, I say I'll settle for making the world a less bad place. Given all the battles we've been in, some of which, if not many of which, we've lost, we have dents in our fenders, but we persevere.
Yeah, well said. Well, thank you again for this opportunity. I'm very appreciative.
Okay, Rhett. Thank you once again. Talk to you soon.
If you've enjoyed this podcast, please remember to check out other episodes, from ayahuasca to magic mushrooms, from the ethnobotany of warfare to the history and prehistory of wine. Please give us a top rating and subscribe and share with like-minded folks. We appreciate your support for the protection of the knowledge and biodiversity of South America by the Amazon Conservation Team. In our next episode, we'll hear from host Dr. Mark Plotkin in a highly anticipated episode, diving deeply into the ethnobotany of your favorite morning pick-me-up, coffee.